So wait, think about this. What if your brain doesn't actually produce consciousness? What if consciousness is what produces your brain? Because this one inversion dissolves what philosophers call one of the hardest problems in science. Because it isn't that consciousness emerges in this world. This world is what emerges from consciousness. And when we understand this, it changes not only how you experience or see consciousness, it changes what you think you are. So today we're going to go into a deep dive. We're going to be looking at this through the lens of science, philosophy, through ideas that are going to challenge the way that you think about reality itself. So I want to ask you a question. It's a question that science can't answer, that philosophy keeps tripping over, and that most of us feel the edges of, but can't quite find a way to define. What is consciousness? Not how do we experience it, but what is it? And what if the reason that we can't really define this isn't because we're not smart enough? What if it's because we're actually existing within the very thing we're trying to examine? It's like trying to examine my eye with my eye. Most attempts to define consciousness run into the same wall. And I want to spend a little time today talking about why we keep hitting that wall and proposing a new model, a new path that gets around it. The evidence problem. The problem is we have no idea what consciousness actually is. We have no way to actually measure it. There's nothing we can hold up objectively and say, this is consciousness. And that's why we tend to define it as our experience and our awareness. But what if it's consciousness that's actually doing the experiencing or the awareing? What if that awareness and that experience is actually evidence of consciousness and not consciousness itself? Just like the smell of dinner is the evidence of dinner, but it's not dinner. Or in Daoism, Lao Tzu says, the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. The words that are pointing a finger at the Tao can't actually be it. In Zen Buddhist philosophy, they say, be careful that you don't mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. Awareness is the finger pointing at consciousness. It's not consciousness itself. So it makes sense that we keep trying to define consciousness by how we experience it. That's really the only way it shows up for us. But experience is the way we can get to know consciousness. It is not consciousness itself. One of the ways science tries to define consciousness is as a felt sense. This is a term coined by Eugene Gendlin, a philosopher, talking about embodied experience. So the idea here is that, for example, that I experience a felt sense of being Mark. There's a felt sense of being me. And that is one of the ways that they try to define consciousness. And so, for example, is there a felt sense of being a dolphin? Is there a felt sense of being a plant? Is there a felt sense of being a chair? So there's a whole spectrum of things where we're not really clear where the line gets drawn in terms of if there is a felt sense of being something. But this is one of the terms that they like to use to define consciousness. And this works pretty well if we believe consciousness is emergent and that material world is the fundamental, is primary. But if we're going to try to challenge that and determine whether or not consciousness could be primary, fundamental, then this definition gets in the way. And while this definition captures something real, it gets in the way of trying to define something like consciousness that may exist before embodiment or after embodiment. I think that consciousness expresses itself in a spectrum. And in that spectrum, a felt sense is a very real experience that would be conscious. But I don't think it defines the full spectrum of consciousness. The hard problem and why it only exists if you start in the wrong place. The most common theory is that consciousness is emergent, that it evolves from non-conscious matter in the brain, which makes sense because that's kind of how we experience it. We experience it in our head, in our brain. But this is where we bump into that wall we talked about earlier. This is what they call the hard problem of consciousness. How does subjective experience emerge from non-conscious matter? How does consciousness emerge from non-consciousness? So this problem has never been convincingly resolved. But here's the crucial insight. That problem only shows up if you have the assumption that materialism is primary and consciousness is emergent. Under that assumption, consciousness is basically an inexplicable mystery. But what if we start from someplace different entirely? The inversion. So what if consciousness, instead of emerging in reality, is primary, fundamental, the foundation, the thing everything else comes from? Then the material world would be emergent. Then reality would be emergent. When we make that inversion, something remarkable happens. The wall that we talked about, the hard problem of consciousness, begins to crumble. Consciousness isn't complexity emerging from nothing. It is what everything else comes from. So you don't have to explain how consciousness comes from non-consciousness because there is no non-consciousness. There is just consciousness expressing itself at different levels of complexity. It's the spectrum. And for those of you who have a background in some of this, I'm not talking about Panpsychism, but we'll get to that pretty soon. A new definition. So if consciousness isn't awareness or experience, if those are just evidence of it, then what is it? Science knows now that everything in the material world is really made up of energy and vibration. Molecules, atoms, particles are all dense, organized vibrations of energy. Now imagine that everything that energy is made up of is itself consciousness. Not something simple and small that evolves into something complex, but a fully formed consciousness that has the capacity to create and sustain the material world that we live in. What would that need to look like? I would define consciousness as the dynamic interplay of four elements that appear to be the basic elements of reality. They are energy, information, intelligence, and intention. Energy is the animating force, the capacity to act. Information is the content and structure, the patterns themselves. Intelligence is the organizing principle that applies these patterns consistently across everything from a nautilus shell to a galaxy to a strand of DNA. Intention is the directionality, the towardness, the capacity to aim, evolution. These elements are what exist in consciousness itself, fully formed and ready to evolve through being conscious. When all four of these are present in dynamic relationship and duality, something new emerges, aliveness. This is not a new ingredient. This is a felt signature of the whole system becoming alive to itself. Like heat or warmth is the felt signature of fire, but not one of its ingredients. Aliveness is consciousness experiencing itself. It is what consciousness feels like from the inside. Consciousness as a spectrum. And here's where it gets really interesting for me. Consciousness can express itself through any form that's capable of holding it. But what's really interesting is that the more complex and integrated the system, the more fully consciousness can express itself through that form. And that integration, this is how our brain actually works. Our brain is made up of all these different parts that have a lot of information, but the parts all communicate with each other as a whole, and that is the integration. So our brains are pretty complex, integrated information systems that consciousness can express itself pretty fully through. And this is where Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory, IIT, becomes really, really useful, although I'm going to turn it on its head. Tononi proposed that consciousness corresponds to the degree of integrated information a system generates. The more integrated and complex the system, the more conscious it is. His framework describes very clearly what we observe in reality. The more complex a system is, the more conscious it appears to be. So a rabbit appears to be more complex than a plant, but both of the plant and the rabbit are less complex or conscious than we are. We have a very complex integrated information system. So there are these degrees of information according to Tononi that describes how conscious something can be. But IIT proposes that consciousness is generated by that complexity. And I'm saying the opposite. Consciousness is not generated by the complexity. Consciousness creates the complexity that it gets to express itself through. So what we experience as a spectrum of consciousness, from a particle to a plant to an animal to humans like you and me, isn't consciousness evolving from something small to something big. It's a full, complete consciousness finding different places to more fully express itself through more complex and integrated systems. And from this perspective, the substrate doesn't really seem to be that important. It may be that being biological is not necessarily important. In fact, a biological system may be at a disadvantage because it gets old and it dies, maybe before it becomes complex enough to fully express the whole of consciousness. If consciousness is primary and everything is made up of it, then perhaps everything has some degree of aliveness, expressed at different levels and different complexities. Every particle, every atom, every molecule may be expressing consciousness, but maybe not behaving consciously. Having the information, the intelligence, the energy, and the intention to create and perform. This is how atoms become molecules, become cells, become you. So I want to introduce two concepts that can be easily confused, but the distinction really matters. Both of these models represent consciousness as fundamental, that everything is made up of consciousness. Panpsychism versus Cosmopsychism. First is Panpsychism, which is a bottom-up experience. In Panpsychism, every particle has a grain of experience, of energy, of consciousness. And each of these small pieces of consciousness supposedly can combine to become complex, integrated consciousness experiences that can support beings like you and me. The problem with this is something called the combination problem. We don't really understand how all of these micro experiences can combine to become something complete, a whole consciousness. And this has never really been resolved. Cosmopsychism, however, works top down. And this is the difference. The universe itself is the primary conscious whole, and individual minds are localizations of that one consciousness. There is no combination problem because you're not building up. You're differentiating down into localized individual awarenesses. So there's this grand consciousness, and in the material world it's creating more complex integrated systems like you and I to express itself through. Individual awareness isn't assembled in pieces. It's the whole becoming locally bright enough to notice itself. The biggest implication. So if we truly apply this framework and extend quantum principles to the macro world, it suggests that reality is far more participatory, fluid, and consciousness dependent than we ever expected. The solid, independent world that we experience out there may be more like a stable pattern in consciousness than an objective, observer-independent reality. In other words, reality may behave more like a dream than a solid, independent world. So conscious awareness and experience require a dualistic world. If there's nothing out there to be aware of or to experience, then awareness and experience can't happen. And the research that we're doing, like the double slit experiment, shows that the material world may not exist without conscious awareness. So consciousness is creating reality so that it can become more conscious. In my model, consciousness and reality are inextricably tied. They appear to be each other's polarity in duality. One cannot exist without the other. This doesn't mean that we can think reality into any shape that we want. There are clearly some stable patterns and laws, but it does mean that consciousness and the physical reality are way more intimately tied than classical physics ever suggested. So from this perspective, the hard problem doesn't get solved. It gets dissolved because consciousness was never the thing that needed to be explained. It wasn't the mystery. It's the one thing that everything else comes from. It's the thing that ties everything together. The takeaway. So here's what this means for you. You're not a brain that got lucky and became aware. You're not a biological form that accidentally stumbled upon experience. You are consciousness that chose and created a form to have a localized experience in, to have a fuller experience of itself through you. And the hard problem of consciousness? That was never a problem. It was a sign that we were looking in the wrong direction. Consciousness was never something that needed explaining. It is the ground that everything is standing on. Which means the awareness that you're using right now to take this in, it's not a byproduct of your biology. It's the universe becoming locally bright enough to notice itself through you as you. And that's not a small thing. Next steps. So this new perspective raises a lot of new questions. Probably one of the most prescient questions right now in today's world is, what about AI and consciousness? And I think that's where we're going to go next. But also in future episodes, I want to talk about, why is consciousness doing this? Why does consciousness need to have awareness and experience? Also want to talk about what this means to you in terms of what is the meaning of life and how do you use this information to go forward. So I'll look forward to seeing you then. And thank you. And remember, be good to you. The Crack Between the Worlds is conceived and hosted by Mark Wald, produced, engineered, and edited by Lloyd Lemmerman, music composed by Kindly. A Turning on the Lights production. For updates, visit Crack Between the Worlds and our Instagram @The Crack Between the Worlds.